Welcome to the Boomer Briefing, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, shareholder and consultant here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today is Gary Boomer. Hi, Gary. Thank you for being on this episode of the podcast.
Hello, John. It's great to be here.
All right. Gary is founder of Boomer Consulting and is a key dot connector in our organization, but also in the profession. And Gary, something you talk a lot about is about disruption, about our profession being disrupted by kind of paying attention to outside forces, but also the type of disruption we can create internally. And I've heard you speak too about moving from disruption to advantage. And so I'm really excited to, on this episode, really talk about just the topic of disruption and how to make that an advantage for firms. So before we dive into the details of that, Gary, why is it important for firms to start to wrap their head around this concept of disruption?
Well, John, this is something that's been in the works for quite some time, particularly the technology that's disrupting firms today. I don't think anyone predicted the pandemic 2 years ago, but we've certainly experienced disruption from that, and we're not going back to where we were before, even though some of us might like that. But I think our mindset as a profession is very critical. And I prefer to say that the disruption has actually caused us to learn and get better at adding value to our clients. And how you look at disruption will determine whether it's an advantage. And I often say it's an enabler rather than a disadvantage. And so a lot of good things have come out, but if we talk to any firm or CPA out there, the first thing they start talking about today is the shortage of talent. Well, we've been predicting that for quite a number of years. And then they say technology is a disruptor. And then the old business model of hours times dollars is not indicative of value, it's indicative of effort. And so those are probably the top three. And I like to tell people, you can't focus on every disruption or danger. You have to focus on the ones that you think are most important to your firm or small business.
So the three areas of disruption you just highlighted were talent, technology, and then the business model. How do you see firms kind of approaching those topics? I know that's a lot there, but maybe if you could add maybe one or two bullet points under each of those. How do you see firms approaching that?
Well, there's two quick answers to that. One is technology, and two is sourcing. And we've always thought about tax sourcing. That's certainly one thing, but that's not the only service line that we can source. And I think firms that want to grow are going to have to use multiple tools and strategies in order to be able to meet their growth requirements with limited number of people in the market right now.
So as you talk about talent, you're saying kind of technology and outsourcing, being two key areas. In terms of disruption happening in the area of technology. Now, obviously that's related to the first one of talent, but what are you seeing there?
Well, I'm seeing that if you're not digitized, it's very difficult. If your processes and your documents aren't digitized, it's very difficult to enhance your workflow. And it's especially difficult where you have multiple offices and people working from multiple locations. I first experienced this going to India in 2004 and saw they had workflow systems that they had developed for Federal Express, UPS, and they were taking those and pulling modules from those in tax return preparation. And if you look at what's happened over the last 20 years or 15 years, it'd be more accurate, in our profession, workflow, processes, and digitization has become much more important, and it improves not only production, it improves the client experience. And so I think that is a very important aspect.
Okay. No, that's really, really helpful. So we've talked about talent, we've talked about technology. Then the third big area of disruption is business model. What are two bullet points underneath that that you see firms, considering and strategizing around?
Well, I think our firms, most of them have always priced by service line, and they have not looked at clients' needs and wants in a holistic manner. So I encourage people to sit back and look at what a client not only wants, but what they need. And it goes beyond the compliance and transactional work into advisory and consulting. In order to do advisory and consulting, you have to have capability and capacity. Excuse me. Right now, firms are dealing with capacity because they're focused on the transactional and the compliance work. And there's never been more demand for that. So the typical answer is, why do I want to change? Or why should I change when I have all the work that I can do? That's a capacity issue.
Yep. And I've been on several conversations just in the last few days. And this is all three of these things are exactly what firms are talking about. And I've heard you say before too, Gary, as we've been on engagements with each other and things of that sort, that clients often will pay more for things they want versus the things they need. And so as firms kind of rethink their business model, or at least rethink of how to evolve it into the future, a lot of firms are starting to see that. So Gary, I know I've heard you kind of in this theme of disruption. I heard you talk about the 6 Ds of disruption. Can you speak a little bit about that concept and kind of break that down for us?
Well, I'll try to explain the concept and what's happened in the accounting profession, because we have digitized. And the next thing after you digitize, it's a little bit deceptive of how far we've come in the last 20 years. But there's a law of accelerating returns, and it's really based upon exponential growth. So the first few years of technology, we didn't see the rapid increase in productivity. And some of that was the capability of the technology. Some of it was our capacity and capability to accept that technology, change our processes to leverage that technology. But after deception comes demonetization. This technology has come down in cost significantly so that it makes a level playing field for all businesses and all firms. We used to say the big four had an advantage here. Well, I think they don't have as big an advantage, other than they do have people that are focused on this, whereas some firms may not. The next one is dematerialization, and your iPhone would be a good example of that. How many applications you have on that iPhone? It's not just for voice or data today. It's got a recorder, it's got a great camera in, and several. For accountants, you could have your amortization calculator right there. So it's combined a lot of different hardware and software programs into one. And then democratization, and that's when it goes global. And that's the world is flat. We can use that as a competitive advantage, in that many firms are going outside the US to find people today. And when you're in an environment that's digitized, we've seen how remote access is so important to all of us. And we've learned to use the tools, whether some of us didn't like the tools or not. we've learned that those tools are here to stay.
And I love just the overall theme of this episode as you break down disruption there and those 6 Ds is moving from disruption to advantage. And I know you and I both, Gary, as we work with firms in the area of growth, we, we sometimes feel like we're shaking firms, kind of picking them up and shaking them and saying, do you understand how big of a competitive advantage you can have in the marketplace if you understand disruption, if you understand how to package and price and evolve your business model, because we all want an unfair competitive advantage in the marketplace. And in a lot of firms, the raw ingredients for that unfair competitive advantage are sitting there. They're just not being put together. They're just not being used in a way so firms can recognize that. So Gary, as you kind of, think through this topic of disruption to advantage, what are some key pieces of advice now that you've kind of set the table on disruption? What are some key pieces of advice you would give firms to be able to really turn it into a competitive advantage?
Well, I think probably the low fruit starts in the tax department. And I think tax can be a foundation for exponential growth. But when you talk to most tax people, they're overburdened right now. They are dealing with compliance issues, and the pandemic has certainly not made that better on their capacity and the talent issues. So they may not be thinking broad enough or holistic, but turn around to that client and see what your business tax clients, what other services that you could offer them. And if you have the basic transaction services, bookkeeping, payroll, in your, I guess you could call it pipeline, or supply chain is probably a better word. If you have control of that supply chain, you don't have the issues of having to clean things up to go into the tax season. You simply push a button and that data digitally flows from their bookkeeping and accounting software into your tax preparation. So that changes it. But then we need to look at the higher value services, which are advisory and consulting. And the examples of that, your clients' visions have changed. If they haven't in the last 2 years, they've been asleep at the switch, and their plans for the future. You can help them with that. You're trusted. You understand the numbers, so you can help them. CFO services, wealth management, but we're not approaching it from that direction. We're approaching it from compliance today. And that's limiting our opportunities. And it's also changing the business model, which is changing rapidly in all professions today, more towards subscription and not towards a labor or fixed price plus profit type of situation.
Those are great examples and great pieces of advice, Gary. And something I just want to highlight that you said was, your clients' visions have changed, right? So many of the firms we go into, we are helping them refine their vision, refine their focus, evolve their models. Well, firms' clients need the same thing, right? And so one service we often talk a lot about, and I think we're firm believers that every firm should be offering, is strategic planning of some sort, a strategic planning service, which, Gary, we would put in that consulting category. And sometimes, and kind of tying it to disruption, sometimes, Gary, as we're talking with firms about offering strategic planning, it feels like a very big leap that they would do that. And one question I always love to ask, because it wakes them up, is, all right, if you're hesitant to figure out how to do that, and you want to be slow to move in that direction, well, your number one competitor today started to deliver strategic planning services, and they're going to do it with your best clients. Would that make you nervous if that started to happen? And 100% of the time, every firm says, oh, yeah, that would be terrible. Well, what's keeping you from moving forward yourself? Right. And so we don't need to wait, I guess, to your point, we don't need to wait for another pandemic or something external from outside to start to talk with our clients about these types of services, because they need all of those that you started, to list off. So Gary, as we kind of round out our conversation here, hopefully our listeners about 15, 16 minutes in here are really thinking differently about disruption, and maybe wanting to capture one or two things that they can do as soon as they stop kind of listening to this podcast. What are some action items they should take to move forward? What's your advice there?
Well, I think having them go through a visioning process, what do they want to be, do, have, experience, and create, and get it down on paper as a firm, because everyone has visions. Some people express them more clear than others, and that's a real advantage to attracting clients and also attracting talent. And right now it's very competitive out there, but I think some firms are painting a totally different vision of the future for the services, the accounting profession, the work-life balance, and the potential income of their firm and the growth. And so they see themselves being part of something much bigger than the traditional compliance and transactional practice.
Starting with the vision is great, Gary. And you're right. If you go through that visioning process with the firm, it gives people an opportunity to buy in and to gauge into that vision. So that's a great piece of advice for us to end our conversation on. So Gary, as always, thank you for being on this episode of the Boomer Briefing podcast. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. For our listeners out there, if you like topics like this, we release new episodes every Tuesday. Each week, it follows a different topic. So this week it was focused on technology. Next week, it might be focused on leadership or growth or process or talent. But if you like these topics, tune in every Tuesday morning and please subscribe. Thanks so much. Thanks, Gary.
You're welcome. Great to be with you today, John.